Today we're going to talk about money, a lot of money. I've always wondered what happened to the funds of the East German Socialist Unity Party, the SED, after the system collapsed in 1990. So I started investigating, and what I found was certainly worth making a video about. Coming up. Hi and welcome to another East Germany Investigated video. In 1989, political developments in the German Democratic Republic accelerated rapidly. There were many protests, the dismissal of leading party members, starting with Erich Honecker, the country's leader, in mid-October of that year, and of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall not even a month later. All the changes happening in the country had their effect on the ruling party, the SED, that was losing members rapidly. The East German people wanted freedom and transparency, and these weren't exactly the things promoted by East Germany's Socialist Party. At that time it wasn't clear what the future of East Germany, and therefore also the future of the SED, would look like. And in such an uncertain situation, a small number of well-informed party members became very nervous. What would happen to them? What would happen to their party? And what would happen to their party's assets? It was the start of a period in which, under time pressure and in the greatest secrecy, many actions and transactions took place that were far from legal. But before I continue, thanks again for liking, sharing and subscribing. You might have noticed the banner behind me. It's a kind gift from Pete, who is from the UK. Although I don't plan to start a museum, to have an original East German flag was on my wish list. Thanks again, Pete, and also many thanks to those of you who have donated a super thanks. Now back to 1989. On December 3rd, only weeks after the Berlin Wall fell, the Central Committee and the Politburo, the top echelons of the country's leadership, resigned. On the same day, hundreds of thousands of people protested, demanding prosecution and punishment of those who had abused their power and corrupted the party, and demanding disclosure of the party's financial records. A few days later, the first free elections were announced. It had become clear that the dictatorship in the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, had ended. But until the elections in May, which later would be brought forward to March, the SED would still remain the most powerful party. And that party had, ever since its foundation in 1946, built up a large amount of funds and assets. It possessed an enormous amount of cash, also deposited in foreign banks. The SED also had accumulated real estate, publishing houses and factories. With the original leaders now having been expelled from the party and in some cases even being prosecuted, new rulers emerged at the top. Hans Modrow became the country's leader in November. Modrow had been the SED leader of the Dresden district for 16 years, but had been working for the party since the early 1950s. Gregor Gysi, an attorney and a loyal member of the party for more than 20 years, was elected the new chairman of the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, on December 3, 1989. Gysi was against dissolving or refounding the SED. Instead, the party's name was changed to SED-PDS, where PDS stood for Partei des Demokratischen Sozialismus, Party of Democratic Socialism. 2 months later, in February 1990, its name was again changed to PDS only, a name that it would keep for the next 15 years. And in that same month, Neues Deutschland, the official SED party newspaper, reported some financial figures of the SED. For the first time in history, the paper reported that the party's income over 1989 had been 710 million marks of member contributions plus 720 million from its businesses and operations. In addition, there was organizational and administrative income of 64 million, making a total income of 1,495 million marks. However, its total expenses was reported to be 1,645 million. The article said that the shortfall of 150 million was taken from the reserve fund. The total party assets were not disclosed. But what was the value of the total assets of the former SED, now PDS? The SED had not simply been a political party, but it had been the ruling party, and it had been interwoven with many political but also non-political organizations in the country. At the beginning of 1990, it wasn't possible to get a clear overview because of its complicated and largely secret organizational structure. More transparency was needed. A law was passed that required all parties to annually share their financial statements. However, the PDS failed to do so. In March 1990, the first 3 elections in East Germany were held, resulting in a new elected parliament, the Volkskammer, the People's Chamber, in which the PDS won only 16% of the seats. The new government decided to appoint an independent commission to review the assets of the parties and the so-called mass organizations. The UKPV, die Unabhängige Kommission zur Überprüfung des Vermögens der Parteien und Massenorganisationen der DDR, the Independent Commission for the Review of the Assets of the Parties and Mass Organizations of the GDR. The commission started work in June 1990 and would continue to exist till the end of 2006. It would conclude that the total cash assets of the SED at the end of 1989 in the GDR amounted to 6.1 billion marks. And let me give you an idea of how much that was. The East German mark was a non-convertible currency, which means that there was no formal exchange rate with the West German Deutschmark, the British pound, the US dollar or whatever. But looking back now, we can take the German currency union that would take place on the 1st of July 1990 as a reference point. Overnight, most private assets were assigned the same value in Deutschmarks. All organizations and companies were granted a Deutschmark value of half of their East marks. And for foreigners, the rate of their GDR bank accounts was 3-1. So the 6.1 billion marks, taking into account an inflation of around 150% over the last 35 years, would, roughly speaking, be 4 billion euros today. 3.4 billion British pounds or 4.6 billion US dollars. But over and above that vast sum, the SED also had real estate and businesses and money held abroad. In February 1990, the PDS announced that it would transfer something over 3 billion East marks of its assets to the East German state for social and cultural purposes. According to them, it was the part of the former SED assets that logically should be considered property of the German Democratic Republic as a state, and not the assets of an independent party. So, where did those 3 billion marks that the PDS transferred end up? Well, the interesting thing is that it was more or less the PDS itself that had decided who was eligible to receive the money. Research that was done only years later revealed that part of the money went to organizations that were owned by the party itself. One of the reasons why such a thing could happen was that it was not always clear if some of the beneficiaries had been part of the SED or not. And especially during the period before April 1990, when the new government took office, no one was asking critical questions. One example is the Alt-Berliner Verlag, a publisher of children's books. In 1990 it was privatized and the PDS sold it. But in fact, the buying price of 1.5 million GDR marks was never paid. It remained a loan from the PDS, and on top of that, the PDS transferred 5 million marks to the publisher as cultural support. When later the Treuhandanstalt, the organization tasked with privatizing the GDR, found out about this, the company was put under their custody, and they sold it. And of the 5 million marks, only 2.2 million were able to be recovered. The rest was gone. There are many cases where the money transferred to an organization was not a gift, but an interest-free loan. For example, 750 million marks was transferred to the GDR state insurance, the staatliche Versicherung der DDR. The agreement was that they should hold the money until a later point in time, where they would transfer it back. When the Treuhand found out in 1993, a quarter of the money was already gone. A considerable part had been paid to former SED employees. In addition to supporting the former party operations, the PDS transferred more than 480 million marks to institutions and individuals. An example is the Islamische Religionsgemeinschaft, the Islamic Religion Association, which was founded in February 1990 in East Berlin. In a country with little foreigners, this already arouses suspicion. And indeed, the organization had been established on the name of Abdelmajid Younes, who was an arms dealer working for the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was his task to get millions of the SED out of the country. A total of 136 million GDR marks was transferred to his association, 75 million as a gift, almost 10 million as an advance payment, and the rest as a loan for 3 properties, all of them holiday accommodations, which Younes had to modernize to make them viable under free market conditions. But when Mr. Younes went to the bank with his 75 million check in June 1990, he was just a few days too late. As of the beginning of that month, the total former SED assets were under control of the Independent Commission. This was also a case in which the Commission was not able to get back all the money that had already been transferred, because the arms dealer had officially been declared bankrupt. But in many other cases, and with far smaller amounts, transactions remained undetected, some even till today. Mid-1990, the PDS tried to explain the so far uncovered manipulations by saying that the leadership of the party had been completely replaced and that new leaders had been so busy that they hadn't had sufficient time to pay attention to the party's assets. Although the change of leadership indeed had taken place, it had been the party's own decision to not start a new party but to restructure the SED. It is hard to believe that the chance to keep the SED's assets did not play a role in that decision. The truth is that the SED-PDS had already started to take action to protect its property in December 1989. As of the beginning of 1990, it started founding more than 100 smaller companies that formerly were regular businesses owned by private people. But in fact, these owners were party members who had obtained a large amount of money as a loan under very unusual conditions, such as no or very little interest, mostly for a term of up to 100 years. Using this scheme, the PDS tried to hide more than 360 million marks. A well-known example is that of Mr. Andreas Decker from Chemnitz, the former Karl-Marx-Stadt. He received a loan of 600,000 marks and opened a store called Anglerparadies, Fisherman's Paradise. He also bought a piece of property and opened a guest house. In 1992, Decker closed his store owing to a lack of demand, and he started a restaurant, and then, after just 3 months, a detective agency, and finally he tried running a demolition firm. In the meanwhile, he had rented out his guest house, which had now become a brothel, that was finally shut down following many police visits to the address. Mr. Decker wasn't allowed to start any more new businesses. Many of these seemingly independent companies were later identified by the Independent Commission. In more than one case, they achieved this by studying documents that were confiscated from the PDS offices and other locations with the help of the police. Getting the money back was much harder, even assuming that there was anything left. As I mentioned already, the SED also had businesses outside the GDR. In June 1990, the Independent Commission set to work, demanding clarity about the domestic and foreign assets of the former SED. A few weeks later, the PDS held a press conference and stated that it didn't have any more foreign assets. No financial assets, no land, no shares, no other assets. The Independent Commission demanded an official confirmation of this statement and also that all claims to foreign assets that were owned by the former SED and which the PDS denied the existence of will be preventatively transferred to the Treuhand. But that confirmation took a while. It seemed as if the PDS still needed to finish something behind the scenes. In November 1990, the Independent Commission was suddenly informed about the existence of a company called Orvak. Not by the PDS, but via the newspapers. The PDS first denied that this Swiss company, that served as a holding company for many affiliated companies in the capitalist West, was owned by them. The whole Orvak network, with a value of 34 million D-marks in its books, was placed in the custody of the Treuhand. It only was in May 1992 that the PDS would waive all claims to their foreign assets. Speaking of foreign countries, another interesting scheme by the PDS to keep hold of their funds took place mid-1990. The Soviet Union was at the end of its existence and therefore it was easy to undertake fraudulent transactions involving the Russians. With the help of a Soviet functionary that committed suicide under strange circumstances a few months later, a scheme was set up that would become the base of the so-called Putnik deal. The plan was to find a company to which the SED could claim to have a fictitious debt. By paying the supposed debt, the PDS would be able to get millions out of the country and off their books. In reality, however, they would still own the money now safely stashed away in foreign accounts. A suitable company was found in Moscow. You can guess its name: Putnik. The PDS opened bank accounts in Germany, the Netherlands and Norway, to which it transferred the money of the so-called debt. The total amount involved was 107 million Deutschmarks. These transfers of millions of marks made the bank suspicious, and they informed the authorities, who started an investigation. This led to searches of the homes of the men involved and of the PDS party headquarters. This included the home of Wolfgang Langnitschke, the PDS finance division manager. 1 week later, Gregor Gysi flew to Moscow to talk to the Soviet party, but there was no support to be expected from the Soviet comrades. The millions were transferred back to the PDS. In 1998, Wolfgang Langnitschke died in a traffic accident in Lugano, Switzerland, while trying to cross the street. Again, a mysterious death, which some suggest may be related to the fact that he had said he refused to take the blame for the Putnik deal. Langnitschke had openly stated that he felt like a sacrificial lamb. In December 1994, the PDS suddenly made it on the front pages. Gregor Gysi and a number of his comrades had gone on hunger strike. The reason? A few weeks before, they had received a handwritten note from the German tax authorities. Based on the sales of former SED property and inventory, it said that the PDS had made almost 200 million Deutschmarks. This meant that it would need to pay 67 million marks in tax. The PDS denied it and said that it would mean the end of the party. After a week, the hunger strike ended. It was decided that the Treuhand, which administered the old SED assets, had to settle the tax bill. As early as December 1989, party officials started looking for a way to hide the party's assets. In 1990, the PDS took over and used their domestic and foreign operations to ensure a smooth transition to a market economy. A company that must be mentioned here is Zentrag, which stands for Zentrale Druckerei Einkaufs- und Revisionsgesellschaft, Central Printing, Procurement and Audit Corporation. It was the largest enterprise of the SED, and in 1989 Zentrag transferred 646 million marks to the SED, 43% of the party's total income. Zentrag held a monopoly in the GDR in the area of newspaper publishing and large-scale printing plants. The SED, being the owner of almost all publishers, is understandable. They wanted to have control of the media. The largest East German newspaper, Neues Deutschland, with 1 million copies sold daily, was also part of Zentrag. Zentrag also owned a large number of properties, such as holiday homes and medical facilities. The company Novum was founded in 1951 in order to facilitate trade between the GDR and foreign countries. In the GDR, enterprises were not allowed to organize foreign trade themselves. It all had to happen controlled by the state, Novum being one of its vehicles for this purpose. Novum worked on a commission base and generated huge sums of money. Beginning of 1990, it had around 500 million D-marks on its accounts. Novum was a daughter company of Zentrag, but it took until 2004 till this was formally legally confirmed. And there is an interesting story behind that. In 1978, an Austrian lady, Rudolfine Steinling, took over 50% of the Novum shares. She was a member of the Austrian Communist Party, the KPÖ, and therefore also nicknamed Rote Fini, Red Fini. The transfer of the shares was intended as a camouflage, making less clear that Novum still was a 100% SED company that had hundreds of millions on its foreign accounts. In 1983, she also took over the other half of the shares. During its lifetime, the SED sponsored communist political parties throughout Europe. Logically, that included the Communist Party in West Germany, the DKP, the Socialist Unity Party of West Berlin, the SEW, and also the KPÖ in Austria. But when in the 1990s the Novum accounts were frozen by the Treuhand, Rudolfine Steindling started a legal action. She claimed that Novum was a KPÖ company, and as she had been 100% owner since 1983, the money was hers. The court agreed. However, in March 1994 there was a remarkable ad that appeared in the German and even some Austrian and Swiss newspapers. It said, "Wanted GDR party funds." It was an action of the independent commission that was still looking for many missing millions. They offered a reward of up to 5 million Deutschmarks for the crucial information. Although this campaign didn't lead to many valuable tips and there was no one who got paid 5 million marks, at least some valuable information emerged regarding Novum. Secret documents came to light proving that the company had continued to be an arm of the SED. Rotefini lost the case, but more than half of the money, around 135 million euros, was gone. Rudolfine Steindling, who was known for her extravagant lifestyle, had already transferred it to other foreign accounts. Rotefini spent her last years of her life in Israel, where she died in 2012. The real estate portfolio of the party consisted of almost 2,000 properties. Almost 1,000 of them were managed by corporation Fundament that was founded right back in 1946. Almost 800 pieces of property belonged to the Zentrag. The total proceeds discovered by the Independent Commission for the SED property amounted to 200 million euros. And there is another organization that needs to be mentioned. The Commercial Coordination Division, Kommerzielle Koordinierung, also called COCO, led by Alexander Schalk-Golodkowski. COCO was a government organization that, by means of all kinds of commercial activities, earned money for the East German state. COCO's activities were often secret and also questionable. I made a video about COCO previously, which you can find here or in the link in the description. COCO also had its own organization consisting of many companies, but some of the activities of COCO were related to the SED. The Independent Commission had a hard job unraveling the opaque structure. It was a difficult task to track down the hidden treasures of the SED, which used to be one of the richest parties in Europe. Immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, the SED Finance Administration started shredding documents. Added to that, there was the unwillingness of the PDS to be completely transparent about the past and the fact that they did shady transactions to hide their assets. But in the end, a lot was clarified thanks to the Independent Commission, which in total managed to recover assets of the SED and other GDR mass organizations worth 1.6 billion euros. However, a rough estimate is that hundreds of millions have vanished without trace. How much exactly is something we will never know. The PDS party later merged into what is now Die Linke. Die Linke is represented in the German Bundestag with 64 of the 630 seats, and the party's contemporary structures do not include the large SED-era corporate empire anymore. The number of former SED members in the party is naturally decreasing after so many years, but the historical legacy remains an issue. That's it for today. Thanks for watching and click subscribe and the bell if you don't want to miss out on any future videos on this channel. Hope to see you in the next one.